Sirens weren't supposed to echo through Willow Creek that morning, especially not outside a quiet beige house at the end of Maple Drive. Yet there they were, slicing the air while neighbors rushed to windows, confused, curious, unprepared for what they were about to witness. The paramedics didn't hesitate. They ran straight toward the small wooden ramp that the Homeowners Association had demanded be removed just days earlier. And in that frantic moment, nobody cared about rules, letters, or fines. That ramp became the only reason someone inside that house was still breathing. 3 days earlier, Margaret Lewis had stood in her driveway clutching an official notice with trembling hands. The paper was cold, formal, and painfully clear. The ramp attached to her front steps violated community aesthetic guidelines. She had 7 days to remove it or face escalating penalties. No discussion. No exceptions. No understanding. Just compliance. Margaret had built that ramp for her father. 82 years old, recovering from a stroke, he could no longer manage stairs without assistance. The ramp wasn't decorative. It wasn't optional. It was the difference between dignity and dependence. She had submitted medical documentation, photos, and a polite request for accommodation. The HOA replied with a template response reminding her that visual harmony protected property values. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table staring at the notice while her father slept in the next room. She traced the words again and again, wondering how something so practical could be considered offensive. Removing the ramp meant carrying him. Risking falls. Risking injury. But defying the HOA meant fines she could not afford. So she did nothing. She waited. Neighbors whispered. Some said she should comply to avoid trouble. Others quietly admitted the rule felt cruel but warned her not to challenge it. The board had a reputation for being relentless. Margaret felt small against a system that valued paint shades over people. Then came the morning with the sirens. Her father had tried to get to the bathroom alone. He slipped, collapsed, and struggled to breathe. Margaret called emergency services in panic, her voice shaking so hard the operator asked her to repeat the address twice. When the ambulance arrived, seconds mattered. The paramedics chose the ramp without thinking. They rolled the stretcher down smoothly, quickly, efficiently. No awkward lifting. No delays. No dangerous angles. Just a straight path that saved precious time. And as they loaded her father into the ambulance, several HOA board members stood on the sidewalk, watching silently. For the first time, the ramp wasn't an eyesore. It was undeniable. It was necessary. And everyone knew it. Silence hung heavier than any rule had written. The ambulance doors slammed shut, but the silence on Maple Drive lingered like a held breath nobody dared release. Neighbors stood frozen on porches, pretending to check phones while watching everything. Margaret remained at the curb, arms wrapped around herself, replaying the paramedics' smooth exit down the ramp. She noticed who else had witnessed it. Every HOA board member had arrived within minutes, drawn by sirens and curiosity. They said nothing. They simply watched. By afternoon, Margaret's phone began vibrating with messages from neighbors who had never spoken to her before. Some asked if her father was okay. Others admitted they had received similar violation letters for far smaller issues. A cracked mailbox. A garden statue. Wind chimes. But this felt different. This felt personal. Margaret didn't reply to anyone. She sat beside her father's empty recliner in the living room, staring at the indent where his body usually rested. The house felt too quiet without his labored breathing. Too still. Too aware. She kept picturing the letter on the kitchen table. That evening, a soft knock came at her door. It wasn't a friend. It was Daniel Ruiz from 2 houses down, a man known for avoiding neighborhood drama. He held his phone out toward her. "You should see this," he said quietly. On the screen was a photo someone had posted in the community group. It showed the paramedics rolling the stretcher down her ramp. The caption read, "This is why rules need exceptions." Comments were multiplying rapidly. People were tagging board members, asking questions, demanding explanations. Margaret felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not fear. Not anger. Something steadier. Something like validation. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this. Daniel looked at her and nodded toward the street. "They're starting to realize," he said. Margaret stepped outside with him. Several neighbors were gathered in small clusters, talking in low voices. Not gossiping. Discussing. She heard words like accommodation, compassion, and legality floating through the air. Someone mentioned disability rights. Someone else mentioned lawsuits. Margaret felt the ground suddenly shift beneath the situation. The ramp had stopped being her problem. It was becoming everyone's question. And the HOA, for the first time, had no prepared letter for this. Porch lights flicked on as dusk settled, and conversations refused to end. Margaret realized the story was no longer quiet. It was moving, person to person, faster than any notice taped to a door. For days she had felt powerless. Now she felt witnessed. And that changed something fundamental inside her. She didn't know what would happen next, but she sensed the board members knew they could not ignore this anymore. The night felt charged with streets. Continue to. Margaret barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the stretcher gliding down the ramp and the HOA members standing motionless on the sidewalk. By morning, her phone was flooded with notifications. The neighborhood group had exploded overnight. Dozens of comments. Arguments. Screenshots of the violation letter someone had reposted. People were no longer whispering, they were demanding answers in public. At 9:12 a.m., an official email arrived from the HOA. Subject: temporary suspension of violation notice. Margaret read it twice to make sure she wasn't imagining the words. The tone was stiff, carefully worded, and noticeably different from the original letter. Due to recent events, the board had decided to pause enforcement regarding the ramp while they conducted a review. There was no apology. No acknowledgement. Just a retreat disguised as procedure. But it was enough. Within minutes, her doorbell rang again. This time it was Mrs. Calloway from across the street, a retired nurse Margaret had only waved to before. She brought a thermos of coffee and sat at the kitchen table without invitation. "I saw the whole thing yesterday," she said softly. "That ramp saved him time. And time saves lives." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. For days she had felt like she was arguing logic against aesthetics. Now someone had witnessed the truth with her own eyes. That changed the weight of the conversation. Around noon, another neighbor stopped by. Then another. People who had lived within 50 feet of her for years were suddenly inside her home, speaking openly about frustrations they had quietly carried. One couple shared how they were fined for installing a handrail for an aging mother. A man admitted he removed a small accessibility feature because he feared penalties. Margaret realized something unsettling. She wasn't the first person the HOA had pressured into choosing appearance over need. She was just the first person whose situation had unfolded publicly. By afternoon, the community group post had spread beyond the neighborhood. Someone had shared it in a local city forum. Strangers were commenting, asking how a homeowners association could deny something medically necessary. The story was leaving Maple Drive. Then Margaret received a call from the hospital. Her father was stable. Breathing easier. Resting. Relief washed through her, but it came with a strange clarity. If that ramp hadn't been there, the outcome might have been very different. She looked at the notice again on her kitchen counter. For the first time, it didn't feel intimidating. It felt outdated. Misplaced. like a relic from a system that had never been questioned before. And now, it was being questioned loudly. At 5:03 p.m., another email arrived from the HOA. This one requested a meeting. Margaret read the email 3 times before it truly sank in. The HOA wasn't summoning her with threats this time. They were requesting a meeting. The wording was cautious, almost polite, as if the board suddenly remembered she was a person and not a violation file. They proposed the clubhouse at 7 that evening. No mention of fines. No mention of deadlines. Just a conversation. She almost laughed. For days, she had begged for dialogue and received only formal notices in return. Now, after sirens and witnesses and online discussions, they wanted to talk. Margaret didn't go alone. When she stepped outside just before 7, she found 3 neighbors waiting at the end of her driveway. Daniel, Mrs. Calloway, and a quiet man named Trevor who had never spoken more than a greeting to her before. "We're coming," Daniel said simply. Margaret hesitated, unsure if this would make things worse. But something in her told her this wasn't just about her anymore. The clubhouse lights were already on when they arrived. Through the glass doors, Margaret could see the board members seated in a row behind a long table. They looked less confident than usual. Papers were scattered. Laptops open. Water glasses untouched. As soon as Margaret entered, she felt the shift. The usual authoritative posture was gone. No one sat back in their chair. No one crossed their arms. They were waiting. The board president, Helen Brooks, cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming, Margaret." Her voice was measured, careful. "We want to address the situation regarding the ramp." Margaret didn't sit. She stood with her neighbors behind her, feeling their quiet presence like a support beam. She nodded for Helen to continue. Helen spoke about community standards. About procedures. About how the guidelines had been written years ago to maintain consistency. She avoided saying the word mistake, but it hung in the air anyway. Then Margaret did something she hadn't planned. She took out her phone and played the short video Daniel had recorded the previous morning. It showed the paramedics running up, then smoothly guiding the stretcher down the ramp. No commentary. No editing. Just reality. The room went silent except for the faint audio of sirens from the video. Helen's eyes dropped to the table. Another board member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. For the first time, they weren't discussing rules in theory. They were watching the outcome of those rules. Margaret finally spoke. "This ramp is not decoration. It's not a preference. It's a necessity. And it could be for anyone here one day." No one interrupted her. Behind her, Mrs. Calloway added quietly, "I saw it happen." That ramp saved critical minutes. The conversation was no longer about aesthetics. It had become about humanity. And everyone in that room felt it. Helen inhaled slowly. "We may need to reconsider our guidelines." Helen's words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. "We may need to reconsider our guidelines." It sounded small, cautious, but inside that sentence was something the HOA had never admitted before. They had been wrong. Margaret finally sat down. Her legs felt weak, not from fear, but from the release of tension she had carried for days. Daniel and the others took seats behind her, silent but present. The board members began flipping through printed copies of the community handbook as if searching for a rule that could rescue them from the moment. There wasn't one. A younger board member named Scott spoke next. He had been the one who signed the original violation letter. His voice was quieter now. "The handbook doesn't mention medical accessibility. It just says exterior modifications must match aesthetic standards." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." Scott looked down at the page. "That's the problem," he admitted. "For years, the HOA had enforced rules without ever imagining a situation that didn't fit neatly into them. They had treated every house the same, believing fairness meant uniformity. But uniformity had ignored reality. People age. People get sick. Needs change. Helen folded her hands together. We never intended to make things harder for you or your father. Margaret met her eyes. Intent doesn't change impact. The sentence settled heavily across the table. Trevor, who had been silent until now, leaned forward slightly. My wife needed a temporary railing after her surgery last year. We removed it after the warning letter. She fell 2 days later trying to manage the stairs alone. Every head in the room turned toward him. He had never shared this story publicly. Margaret realized how many quiet stories had been buried under compliance and fear. Scott looked visibly shaken. Why didn't you tell us? Trevor gave a small, humorless smile. Because the letter didn't ask for context. It demanded removal. The room grew still again. The HOA members weren't being attacked. They were being confronted with reality, story by story, example by example. And the weight of it was undeniable. Helen finally pushed the handbook aside. I think we need to stop looking at what the rules say and start looking at what they missed. Margaret felt something shift permanently in that moment. This was no longer a meeting about her ramp. It was the beginning of something larger. Something that had been overdue for years. Helen took a deep breath. Effective immediately, the violation notice for your ramp is withdrawn. And we will begin drafting an amendment to include medical and accessibility accommodations in our guidelines. Margaret didn't smile. She simply nodded. This wasn't victory. It was correction. News of the meeting spread faster than Margaret expected. By the next morning, neighbors she had never met were waving as she stepped outside to collect the mail. A few stopped to thank her. Not for arguing. Not for winning. But for saying what many of them had quietly felt for years and never voiced. The ramp was still there, unchanged, but it no longer looked like a point of conflict. It looked ordinary. Necessary. Almost invisible in the way truly useful things often are. Margaret received another email from Helen that afternoon. This one wasn't formal. It didn't sound like it had passed through legal review or committee edits. It was written like a person speaking to another person. Helen asked if Margaret would be willing to share her experience at the upcoming monthly HOA meeting. Not as a complaint, but as perspective. She wanted other residents to hear what had happened from Margaret directly. Margaret hesitated. She had never liked speaking in front of groups. But something inside her knew this moment shouldn't be wasted. If change was starting, it needed momentum. That evening, Daniel stopped by again. He had printed screenshots from the community group where people were sharing their own stories now. Small things. Quiet things. A removable ramp for a visiting relative. A widened walkway for a wheelchair. A temporary lift that someone had hidden behind bushes to avoid being seen. Margaret realized the problem had never been the rules alone. It had been the fear of asking for exceptions. 2 days later, she stood at the front of the clubhouse again. This time the room was full. Every chair taken. People standing along the walls. The board members sat to the side rather than behind the long table, a subtle change that didn't go unnoticed. Margaret spoke calmly. She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. She simply described what it felt like to read that letter while caring for her father. What it felt like to choose between dignity and compliance. And what it felt like to watch paramedics use the very thing she had been told to remove. The room stayed silent the entire time. When she finished, hands began to rise. One by one, residents shared their own experiences. Stories the board had never heard because no one believed they would be listened to. Helen took notes the whole time. By the end of the meeting, it was clear the ramp had started a conversation the neighborhood desperately needed. And no one was pretending anymore that the old rules were enough. By the following week, the HOA board circulated a draft of the proposed guideline changes to every homeowner. The document was longer than anyone expected, filled with careful language about accessibility, medical necessity, temporary modifications, and a new review process designed to ask questions before issuing violations. For the first time, the rules acknowledged that homes were lived in by people whose needs could not be predicted by paint charts or landscaping diagrams. Margaret read the draft slowly at her kitchen table while her father rested in the living room, stronger now, breathing easier. Each paragraph felt like a quiet correction to something that had gone unquestioned for too long. The ramp outside her window no longer felt like a defiance. It felt like a catalyst. Neighbors began knocking on her door again, but this time they brought printed copies of the draft with sticky notes attached. They asked her opinion. They asked if certain phrases sounded fair. They asked if anything was missing. Margaret found herself in a role she had never expected, helping shape the very guidelines that had once threatened her. Daniel pointed to one section about temporary medical installations. "This part needs to say no fines during review," he said. Margaret nodded and made a note. Mrs. Calloway suggested adding language about emergency responders needing clear access. Trevor asked for wording that protected residents from being forced to disclose private medical details. Every suggestion came from lived experience. And every suggestion made the document better. At the next meeting, the clubhouse was full again. Helen stood at the front with the revised draft projected behind her. She didn't present it like a rulebook. She presented it like a response to the community's voice. "We built guidelines to protect property values," she said. "But we forgot that the true value of this neighborhood is the people living in it." No one clapped, but the agreement in the room was visible. When the vote was called, every hand went up. Unanimous. Margaret felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. A few weeks earlier, she had stood alone in her driveway feeling powerless against a printed notice. Now, the entire neighborhood had helped rewrite the system that produced it. As people filed out of the clubhouse, several stopped to thank her again. Not because she had fought, but because she had simply refused to remove something necessary. Outside, the evening air felt lighter. The ramp at her house remained exactly where it had always been. But its meaning had changed completely. Life on Maple Drive returned to its familiar rhythm, but something subtle had changed in the way neighbors interacted. People paused longer at mailboxes. Conversations stretched past polite greetings. There was a new awareness that everyone carried unseen circumstances behind their front doors. Margaret noticed it most in the small things. A neighbor across the street installed a short handrail without hesitation. Another added a gently sloped walkway for an elderly aunt coming to stay for the summer. No one whispered. No one reported it. No one feared a letter taped to their door. The revised guidelines were printed and mailed to every home, but they felt less like rules and more like understanding written down. Helen even stopped by one afternoon with a copy for Margaret, though she had already read it twice. "We should have listened sooner," Helen admitted quietly as they stood beside the ramp. Margaret appreciated that she didn't dress the sentence up with formal language. It was simple. Honest. Inside, her father had begun using the ramp independently with slow, careful steps. Each time Margaret watched him move down it safely, she felt a quiet confirmation that standing her ground had been worth every anxious moment. One evening, a delivery truck arrived at the house next door. Two workers unloaded a temporary wheelchair lift for a visiting relative. Margaret watched from her window as they installed it openly, without rush or secrecy. The neighbor saw her watching and smiled instead of looking embarrassed. That smile said everything. A week later, Margaret received a handwritten card in her mailbox. It wasn't signed by an individual. It simply read, "Thank you for speaking when the rest of us stayed quiet." She kept the card on her kitchen counter beside the old violation notice she hadn't thrown away. The two papers sat side by side, representing before and after. Fear and change. Silence and voice. The ramp itself hadn't changed shape, color, or position. But it had become a symbol in the neighborhood, a quiet reminder that rules must bend when real life demands it. And every time Margaret walked past it, she felt a calm pride she had never expected to feel from a simple piece of wood. A month after the sirens, Maple Drive looked exactly the same to anyone passing through. Lawns were trimmed. Mailboxes stood straight. Houses wore the same calm colors the HOA had always preferred. Nothing announced that anything important had happened here. But Margaret knew better. She stood at her front window one quiet afternoon, watching her father make his slow, steady way down the ramp with a walker. No hesitation. No fear. Just careful independence. The sight filled her with a deep, steady gratitude that words couldn't quite hold. Across the street, Mrs. Calloway watered her plants and waved. Two houses down, Daniel adjusted a new railing his wife had installed without asking anyone for permission. Trevor's porch now had a wider pathway where potted plants once stood. These were small changes, almost invisible, but they told a story louder than any meeting ever could. The ramp had done something no argument, no complaint, and no formal request had managed to do. It had made people see. Not rules. Not guidelines. Not property values. People. Margaret kept the original violation notice in a drawer, not as a reminder of anger, but as a reminder of perspective. Systems are often built with good intentions, she realized, but without real stories, they grow rigid. It takes something undeniable to make them bend. She thought back to the moment the paramedics chose the ramp without a second thought. They hadn't asked about regulations. They hadn't paused to evaluate aesthetics. They had simply recognized the fastest, safest path to help someone in need. That clarity had spread through the neighborhood like light through a window. Later that evening, Helen stopped by for a casual visit. No agenda. No paperwork. They stood together on the driveway as the sun dipped low. "I drive past this ramp every day now," Helen said, "and I don't see wood. I see a lesson."
Margaret smiled softly, something she replied it takes an emergency for people to notice what should have been obviously all along. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching her father rest inside. Through the open door, the house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for weeks. Nothing about Maple Drive had changed on the surface, but everything important underneath had. The ramp remained exactly where it belonged.